Part 1. The Globalist Agenda. Make no mistake, we are currently being assailed by a worldwide fraud of such scale and malevolence that it threatens our very existence as we know it on this planet. The fraud concerns a purported virus, invented, not found by virology, which allowed Bill Gates to predict a once-in-a-century pandemic requiring billions of vaccines to combat, by which he meant to vastly increase the assets of the Bill and Melinda Gates Trust that sits alongside the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Another who was eagerly preparing for the deployment of mass vaccines was Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance. As he said in 2015, we need to increase public understanding of the need for medical countermeasures such as a pan-influenza or pan-coronavirus vaccine. A key driver is the media, and the economics follow the hype. We need to use that hype to our advantage to get to the real issues. Investors will respond if they see profit at the end of process. In September 2019, the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, a creation of the WHO and the World Bank, advised countries to prepare for a potential lethal respiratory pathogen by investing in innovative vaccines and therapeutics, surge manufacturing capacity, broad-spectrum antivirals, and appropriate non-pharmaceutical interventions. They further advised that all countries must develop a system for immediately sharing genome sequences of any new pathogen. The world was being prepared for a pandemic. And on December 4th, 2019, Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, stated that his agency was conducting and supporting research to develop state-of-the-art vaccine platform technologies that could be used to develop universal influenza vaccines, as well as to improve the speed and agility of the influenza vaccine manufacturing process. These platform technologies include DNA, messenger RNA, virus-like particles, vector-based, and self-assembling nanoparticle vaccines. Everything was thus set to release genetic and nanoparticle technologies onto unsuspecting populations under the guise of a health crisis just a few weeks away. All it took was the substitution of influenza, which had long since failed to strike fear into the world, with an imaginary, deadly, and novel coronavirus. The events that have transpired over the last 20 months would have seemed inconceivable even 2 years ago, except in the minds of people like Gates and Klaus Schwab, founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, who had already conceived of destroying democracy from within with a self-destructive response induced by fear of such a virus. As Schwab wrote in The Great Reset, sowing the seeds of his global agenda, since making its entry onto the world stage, COVID-19 has dramatically torn up the script of how to govern countries, live with others, and take part in the global economy. It was an extraordinary claim for a coronavirus that was so novel that its spike protein sequence had been patented by its inventors and assigned to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, USA in 2007, and allegedly provided to Moderna in November 2019, a month before COVID-19 leapt onto the world stage in Wuhan. It is a song Schwab loves singing, with Terry Mellerat. The worldwide crisis triggered by the coronavirus pandemic has no parallel in modern history. We cannot be accused of hyperbole when we say it is plunging our world in its entirety, and each of us individually, into the most challenging times we've faced in generations. It is our defining moment. We will be dealing with its fallout for years, and many things will change forever. The globalist chorister, Helen Clark, co-chair of the WHO's Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response, sings from the same hyperbolical song sheet. In less than a year and a half, COVID-19 has infected at least 150 million people and killed more than 3 million. It is the worst combined health and socio-economic crisis in living memory, and a catastrophe at every level. COVID-19 is the 21st century's Chernobyl moment, not because a disease outbreak is like a nuclear accident, but because it has shown so clearly the gravity of the threat to our health and well-being. It has caused a crisis so deep and wide that presidents, prime ministers, and heads of international and regional bodies must now urgently accept the responsibility to transform the way in which the world prepares for and responds to global health threats. These preposterous and unsubstantiated claims from the globalists provide a chorus of fear on which the pharmaceutical companies such as Pfizer rely to extort vast sums of money from nation-states that sell out their people for a song. This extortive practice is the basis of the leaked manufacturing and supply agreement whereby Pfizer required Albania to accept that the Pfizer vaccine was subject to significant risks and uncertainties, that it may not be successful due to a wide range of reasons, and that Pfizer has no liability for any failure to develop or obtain authorization of the product in accordance with the estimated dates described in this agreement. However, many years in the making, the go button was pushed on this globalist fraud when a 41-year-old worker presented at the Central Hospital of Wuhan on the 26th of December 2019 with symptoms indistinguishable from other respiratory illnesses commonplace among the 11 million residents who endure suffocating pollution in the capital of China's Hubei province. Lickety-split, the genome of a virus no one had seen, let alone isolated and purified, was published in early January 2020, renamed SARS-CoV-2 on the 11th of February. The same day, the fraud's chief conductor, the WHO's Director General, Tedros, announced its consequent companion. We now have a name for the disease, COVID-19. I'll spell it, COVID-19, COVID-19. By the end of March 2020, democracy was on its knees. The people excluded from public life, imprisoned in their homes, accepting their fate in the same tragic silence as the sad-eyed of the Shoah, packed into boxcars, rolled across a grey-scale landscape to a fate worse than death. The camps of exclusion were now our homes. And then the unthinkable. Politicians announced that they would be inoculating their populations with highly experimental genetic encoded devices never before used on humans that still had years to run on their already truncated and farcical clinical trials. Our elected representatives didn't bother to tell us that. They also didn't tell us that those who seem to tolerate the initial inoculation may be carrying in their bodies ticking time bombs of potential neurodegenerative and autoimmune diseases, as well as undeclared non-biological objects for undeclared purposes. The Trojan horse. Everything turns on these two concepts, absence and presence. Of what is SARS-CoV-2 predicated? Absence or presence? That is the question we must decide. For without the instantiated presence of SARS-CoV-2, there are no COVID-19 cases to count, and therefore no ground or justification for any government's response to a phantom pandemic. This assault on humanity relies on a Trojan horse to deliver the fraud into our minds and bodies, making possible the fulfillment of the globalist agenda of a population control grid, with the apparent ultimate aim of controlling populations in every way possible. While debates go on around the world regarding the origins of COVID-19, the latest case numbers, its lethality, and the effectiveness of the so-called vaccines, the participants in these debates seem to take something for granted, that a virus actually exists. The vast majority of the public and the medical profession are unaware that the Trojan horse is modern virology and its anti-scientific methods that assert the existence of viruses such as SARS-CoV-2. Most would be surprised to learn that viruses such as these have never been found inside a human or shown to be the cause of disease. Virology's double deception. The COVID-19 crime against humanity requires the absence of this virus, so there is no material reference against which the make-believe genome can be cross-checked to establish, for instance, whether or not the purported SARS-CoV-2 proteins specifically stem from the alleged virus. This illusory trick relies on virology's double deception, the substitution of the dictionary and scientifically postulated meaning of the noun isolation for an antonym, and the substitution of the fake proxy of inducing cytopathic effects by inoculating abnormal cell lines in vitro for the postulated proxy of infecting a healthy or non-diseased host in vivo to establish causality between the purported pathogen and the disease. This double deception constitutes a violation of postulates on which the scientific community has long depended. This physical absence makes of SARS-CoV-2 a fail-safe fraud, one that industry-funded virologists applaud, and one that the medico-pharmaceutical complex both exploits and rewards. So obscure is this black art and so arcane its language that few among the general public would stop to question it. Even Stephen Buston, polymerase chain reaction expert and creator of the Mikey protocols designed to tame the RT-PCR Wild West, falls for this virological fraud, as he revealed in his interview with Eric Coppolino.
There's two definitions of isolation going around, though. One is that you separate it from all else, and the other is you put it into a broth and you find it.
Yeah. Well, that's not really my area of expertise. As far as I'm concerned, I've read the papers, and that's the standard way of isolating a pathogen, so I have no problem with that.
Well, it's the current way that's used, I would say, that the idea of, true purification, you separate it into centrifuge and you've got of only that. Mm-hmm. And then you can, then that is the thing that is sequenced and then used to prime the PCR. It does not appear that's what's happening. From my limited, a year into this.
Well, the way the sequence was established was by taking the sample from the original patients, growing up something, and then sequencing it, and then just assembling the sequence. And what came out of that was a SARS virus, which then very closely resembled a bat SARS virus, and obviously was a different one. So this is a standard way of doing this. So I really don't want to comment. I can't comment any further on that, except that to me that's perfectly acceptable, and that's the way to do it.
4 pillars of the COVID-19 fraud. If P, then Q. Now Q is true, therefore P is true. E.g., if pigs have wings, then some winged animals are good to eat. Now some winged animals are good to eat, therefore pigs have wings. This form of inference is called scientific method. Bertrand Russell, 1946. There are 4 pillars to the worldwide COVID-19 fraud, all of which are interlocking. The first pillar, isolation. The theory of disease-causing viruses dates back to the 1800s, and virologists spent the first half of the 20th century trying to extract these suspected viruses directly from living hosts. The repeated failures led them to change course in the 1950s in order to retain any credibility. The virologists had to provide something to show their potential funders, including the growing pharmaceutical industry, chomping at the bit to develop vaccines and antimicrobial drugs. In 1954, scientists reported that they had evidence of the measles virus based on the observation that a sample from a measles patient had killed some cells in a test tube. These appearances are known as cytopathic effects. The authors admitted that while there is no ground for concluding that the factors in a human are the same as those which underlie the formation of giant cells and the nuclear disturbances in the test tube, the appearance of these phenomena might be associated with the virus of measles. The appearance of cytopathic effects is foundational to modern virology's fraudulent claims of isolation and pathogenicity. A sample is taken from a patient and mixed with some cells in a test tube. The cells die, and it is declared that a virus has been isolated as particles are seen budding off the cells. What virologists don't want you to know is that the same appearance can be generated without adding purported virus samples to the test tube. In other words, it is the process itself, starvation of the cell and the addition of various toxic substances such as antibiotics and antifungals, that cause the already abnormal cell lines to react and die. No virus required. Sometimes photographs of mock infections are provided. However, the details of these experiments are conspicuous by their absence. There are, of course, the images of what are claimed to be the virus causing all our problems. However, the colourful 3D images are nothing more than computer-generated images representing an artist's impression. They have been used by media around the world to fuel the imaginations of the public that a tiny microbe that looks like a sea mine that could hit, then sink them at any time. As for the electron micrograph images put forward in the scientific publications, these simply show nanoparticles budding off from culture cells as described in the laboratory experiments. They are alleged to be the SARS-CoV-2 viruses based on arbitrary declarations. Not one of these key properties has been demonstrated in any of the virological experiments describing purported isolation and pathogenesis. Virologists spent decades attempting this unsuccessfully, and instead of admitting there might be a problem with the whole virus theory, they simply changed the meaning of the word. This is a scandalous state of affairs. The world is currently being held to ransom because virologists do not actually isolate viruses. They just say that they do, and appear not to be troubled that the current assault on humanity relies on the self-evident scientific fraud. The first and foundational fraud is the claim that the virus has been isolated and is the causal agent of COVID-19. Without acceptance of this always unsubstantiated claim, the COVID-19 fraud would implode, as would Gates's once-in-a-century pandemic. In other words, the fraud of isolation relies on the violation of accepted meaning to deceive when, for instance, an isolate has no more been isolated than a wishful thought. This sets up a viciously circular discourse from which there is no escape. The premise of existence is established by the lie, and through its absolute insistence, existence of the virus is conclusively and repeatedly confirmed. Virology thrives on this insistence, for without it, there is no virus, no virology, no positive PCR tests, and no more jobs for virologists inventing viruses for Big Pharma to fight with miraculous vaccines. That is also why ideas that run counter to this narrative are censored by the government and by the mainstream media, and why this country's security agencies are terrorizing the people they claim to be protecting, enforcing upon them the virological fraud on which the whole charade depends. The entire state apparatus is currently dedicated to this cause. Fan Wu et al. Rather than using the method widely used by virologists for claiming isolation and pathogenicity through inducing cytopathic effects, Fan Wu et al., the first inventors of the SARS-CoV-2 genome, sent the sample extracted from the patient's lung fluid straight to sequencing for 2 de novo assembly platforms to search for short genetic fragments, or reads. It is important to note that the samples sent for sequencing were not physically isolated viruses, but crude samples containing millions of unique genetic fragments from the patient himself, innumerable microbes, even from the air the patient had breathed on the way to the hospital. Over 56.5 million reads were produced from this genetic soup and pieced together to create 384,000 contigs on Megahit and 1.32 million contigs on Trinity. Perhaps with a predisposition to prove their unproven canard that there is the ongoing ability of viral spillover from animal to cause severe disease in humans, Fan Wu et al. Chose the longest, which they claimed had a nucleotide identity of 89.1% with the in silico bat coronavirus genome invented in 2018. Thus, a genome that was as close genetically as a human is to a house cat. Subsequently, it was decided that the genome needed a cut and paste, perhaps to make it look even closer to the 29,802 nucleotides of the bat model, and it was reduced to 29,875 nucleotides in the next version of GenBank. But the artists weren't finished with their creation, and a third and final model was drawn with a completely different terminal sequence featuring 23 consecutive adenine bases, which, hey presto, looked more like the bat model that featured 26 consecutive adenine bases on its tail. It is unclear how the virologists knew which genome to choose when all of the options were hypothetical computer constructs. It thus quickly becomes apparent that the anti-science of virology and the perversion of the word isolation is not only delusional, but also highly misleading and no basis for anything, let alone the health and well-being of whole populations. 1 year later, Dr. Wu Zhanyu of the China CDC, in an interview with Janice McKee Freyer, would state that isolation had never taken place.
No, they didn't isolate the virus. That's the issue. I do not suspect it's coming from what we originally thought.
This foundational fraud was rewarded with grants in 2020 totaling US $900,000 from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, made to the 2 institutions with which 14 of the 19 co-authors of the fraud were affiliated. Fudan University received a grant under Invoice 6277 to support the epidemiology study and identify the high risks of COVID-19 infection, which will contribute to national and international public health intervention strategy and product development. totaling US $300,000, and the China CDC received a grant under Invoice 5832 to support emergency response and evaluation and prepare China for the potential pandemic, which will not only help disease control and containment, but contribute China's experience to global health, totaling $600,000. Peng Zhu et al. Similar pseudo-scientific methods and the same false claim of isolation are found in the paper of Peng Zhu et al., received by Nature 13 days after Fan Wu et al.'s, but published online in the same volume, 579, on the same day, 3rd of February 2020. These authors likewise claim successful isolation of what they call 2019 nCoV, but on the basis of the cytopathic effects they observed in 3 cell lines. However, these are illegitimate proxies for the postulated infection of a healthy animal or host. The 3 cell lines employed were VeroE6 cells derived from the kidney of an African green monkey, HUH7, a human liver cell line taken from a liver tumour in 1982 and subsequently cultured, and human HeLa cells derived from a female human in 1951 suffering from cervical cancer and subsequently cultured. None of these cell lines meet the postulated criterion of a healthy host with which to test for pathogenicity, but are favoured as they produce the effects being sought, that is, cytopathic effects and the appearance of extracellular vesicles. To the cell lines were added, among other items, inorganic salts, fetal bovine serum to feed the cells, and an array of cytotoxic items such as amphotericin B, an antifungal, trypsin, which hydrolyzes protein, penicillin, an antibiotic, streptomycin, another antibiotic, glutaraldehyde, a disinfectant, and osmium tetroxide, an acutely toxic oxidizing agent, and epoxy resin to create a solid substrate for ultra-thin slicing. Bizarrely, on the basis that RNA of unknown provenance was part of the culture in which many cells died by way of induced starvation and stress with cytotoxic ingredients, the authors claimed that they had successfully isolated their virus, 2019 nCoV beta-CoV. Not that the cocktail of cytotoxic ingredients had decimated their abnormal cell lines. In short, Peng Zhu et al. Fulfilled none of the postulates to identify the virus or confirm it as being causative of any disease. The alleged virus had not even been physically isolated and purified for biochemical characterization, and hence remained entirely theoretical. This was apparently of no concern to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the foundation providing the Chinese Academy of Sciences, with which 24 of the 27 co-authors were affiliated, with a 2020 COVID-19 related grant under Invoice 6377 totaling US $359,820 for the following purpose: to support developing assays, platform of drug screening and subunit vaccines of coronavirus, which will contribute to product innovation of COVID-19 pandemic control. Na Zhu et al. Published in the New England Journal of Medicine on the 20th of February 2020, Na Zhu et al. Described their study of lower respiratory tract samples, including bronchoalveolar lavage fluid, collected from 4 patients with pneumonia of unknown cause, all of whom had visited the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan shortly before their clinical presentation. Despite claiming isolation of the virus, it is clear that the authors do not mean isolation in the dictionary and postulated sense, but virology's substituted antonymic meaning and the substitution of diseased for non-diseased host cells to establish causality between a purported virus and the patient's illness. In this case, the supernatant centrifuged from the patient's sample was inoculated on human epithelial cells, resected from patients undergoing surgery for lung cancer, although purportedly pathogen-free. In any event, cancer cells would be present in such cells, and as they are wont to do, such cells produce an abundance of exosomes, which would be visible by way of transmission electron microscopy. Unlike Fan Wu et al. And Peng Zhu et al., Na Zhu et al. Did produce images of what they described as 2019 nCoV particles, but without any verification of their biochemical composition from a purified specimen. It is simply impossible to establish from the proffered images that the particles are viruses, or that they contained the alleged SARS-CoV-2 genome. Yet despite this double deception that haunts virology, virologists still cling to their beliefs and their jobs. For as Na Zhu et al. Put it, although our study does not fulfill Koch's postulates, Our analyses provide evidence of implicating 2019 nCoV in the Wuhan outbreak. The basis of this claim seems to be the authors placing arrowheads on extracellular vesicles of unknown composition and christening them 2019 nCoV. Implication and unknown composition, however, was good enough for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which provided the National Institute for Viral Disease Control and Prevention, with which 13 of the 18 co-authors were affiliated, with a 2020 COVID-19 related grant under Invoice 1912-1 for US $71,700 to support China CDC to evaluate the quality of COVID-19 serological diagnostic reagents in China and provide evidence for scientific use of reagents in clinical diagnosis and epidemiological survey. Leon Kelly et al. Leon Kelly et al. Produced their own brand of Antipodean nationalism under the title Isolation and Rapid Sharing of the 2019 novel coronavirus from the first patient diagnosed with COVID-19 in Australia, when they reported on a 58-year-old man from Wuhan who felt unwell when he arrived in Melbourne on 19th of January 2020. When they claimed the Vero cells showed cytoplasmic membrane-bound vesicles containing coronavirus particles, Kelly et al. Were unable to find virions with the purported spike protein, so they added more trypsin to the cell culture medium, and before they could say Jack Robinson, the trypsin, the function of which is to digest proteins, had gobbled up the outer protein layer of a 100 nanometer spherical virion to reveal the characteristic crown-like fringe of spike proteins, which they added without the slightest hint of irony, immediately improved virion morphology. In other words, when the exosomes did not look like their desired virus, they gave it a little trypsinized encouragement. The alleged virions were not purified, so their biochemical composition could not be established. The proffered genome was in fact put together after generating approximately 30 million reads from the tissue culture mix. As per all other papers of this nature, no explanation was provided as to how these particles are known to cause disease, or whether they even exist inside humans. Again, they could only be called extracellular vesicles of unknown significance, produced from abnormal monkey kidney cells in a test tube. Nothing further needs to be said about the follies of this paper and the virological nonsense that informs it, except to add that New Zealand's Ministry of Health states that this is one example of the virus being isolated and cultured in a laboratory setting. COVID-19 Fraud and War on Humanity by Dr. Mark Bailey and Dr. John Bevan Smith. Part 2. The second pillar, genomic sequencing. This unfolding worldwide tragedy has in large part been enabled by the descent of science, the systematic study of the nature and behaviour of the material and physical universe based on observation, experiment and measurement, into scientism, the uncritical application of scientific methods to inappropriate fields of study. The virologists claim that they have worked out the entire genetic structure of viruses such as SARS-CoV-2 and upload this onto databanks, as Van Wu, Peng Zhu, Na Zhu, Leon Kelly and their teams did in early 2020, and as many have done since. Again, they claim they have an isolate of the virus, but this declaration is made after they have constructed the genome from their mixed brew, containing genetic fragments of unknown provenance. In the case of Van Wu et al., despite there being no bats for sale in the indoor seafood market where the patient worked, and despite the inventors being unable to confirm an intermediate host or reservoir for their virus, they chose, nevertheless, another in silico bat coronavirus as the template with which to create WH-human1 SARS-CoV-2. This, no doubt, is all part and parcel of virology's need for scientific validation, expressed in its 20-year quest for Bat El Dorado, wherein it imagines lie all the coronavirus treasures of the world. In the meantime, it keeps inventing viruses to feed Big Pharma to keep itself afloat. The process virology uses to claim isolation can be summarized as follows. From the biological soup taken from patients' lungs or nose swabs, containing all sorts of material from the human subject, innumerable commensal microbes, and potential contaminants, de novo assembly platforms search for short genetic fragments. After finding millions of unique fragments in the brew, these software programs piece together a genome based on parameters set in the program. Along the way there is a bit of cut and pasting, and if pieces are missing, Other ready-made templates can be added to fill the gaps. However, the man-made algorithms, probability models, and arbitrary selections cannot deliver the yes or no answer to the question of its physical existence in nature, not least because any coronavirus genome used as a template in its production will likewise be propositional, the methodology providing no confirmable connection with the material or physical universe, making the new member of the coronavirus genus merely another product of virology's sui referential processes. An analogy for these processes would be that you find 1 million cards on the floor, each with partial sentences. You start arranging them into full sentences, and then eventually a story. If some bits don't fit, you discard them, and if bits seem to be missing, you borrow a paragraph from another story. But how would you know that this was an existing story and not something you had just made up? And why could there not be 10 smaller stories in there or no story at all? In short, you cannot claim to know the story unless you have access to the complete story before you start. And herein lies virology's deception. Virologists do not work with a complete genome because they do not work with a complete virus. They work with random bits of biological material and then tell us that it constitutes evidence of a virus. However, those of us that examine their experiments carefully can see that there's a problem. There is no material proof of any virus. Indeed, what the public is not told is that no virus called SARS-CoV-2 has ever actually been isolated and purified as a whole unique structure. What takes place is simply the shotgun sequencing of crude samples which contain genetic fragments of unknown provenance. Therefore, there is no evidence whatsoever, not even the vaguest guarantee, that the resulting in silico genome exists in nature or has anything to do with a virus. In this manner, however, the invention of the virus is presented as a discovery, its faux status retroactively secured through the act of denotation, whereby its naming purports its prior existence and its pathogenicity. That a notional hypothetical genome invented by such anti-science should lie at the heart of this assault on humanity is a scientific and ethical outrage. It is this false science that has turned the world upside down, providing opportunity for politicians to assume the role of needle Nazis. That is the insidiousness of virology's crime. A generalized version of the false claim of isolation provides politicians with permission to state rape those in the government's employ and to extend their systematic program of bodily violation into the private sector, the latest victims being retail and hospital workers. For the remainder, the crime steals into our consciousness under cover of duty and beneficence, causing many of us to accept into our bodies the unknown contents of vials the government has apparently not bothered to check, produced by a manufacturer with a spectacular record of criminal medical fraud. Contents, furthermore, that smuggle genetic vectors with poorly ascertained effects into our bodies, all for the greater good of protecting society from a deadly disease that does not exist. How a contemporary democracy could have fallen for such preposterous but deadly nonsense is beyond the scope of this essay. Suffice it to say that this is why this New Zealand government is not your single source of truth, but a criminal purveyor of monumental lies it uses as cover for its cowardly crimes against humanity, its acts of terror and democide, and the widespread socio-economic carnage and dislocation it continues to inflict on the people of this whenua, replicating circumstances prior to the establishment of the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. The third pillar, PCR. The third pillar of the COVID-19 fraud concerns the misapplication of the PCR. This misapplication centres on the amplification of RNA sequences taken from human subjects said to belong to SARS-CoV-2 and also a disease termed COVID-19. However, the PCR cannot confirm either of these things. Its capability is solely confined to the amplification of the selected nucleotide sequences, not to determining their provenance or significance. This fraud then relies on the attribution of meaning to the amplified sequences, which is supplied by A. reference to the imaginary in silico genome and not to a proven physical entity called SARS-CoV-2, and B. a disease that with absurd circular reasoning has been defined by the PCR result itself. SARS-CoV-2 has never been located in a human subject, isolated, purified and subsequently photographed and biochemically characterized as a whole unique structure. It has not been proven to exist in nature. In fact, key component parts were patented in 2007, which by definition would require them to be man-made. With regards to the short nucleotide sequences being detected by the PCR kits in use, they exist, but come from somewhere else, not from a virus labelled SARS-CoV-2. Furthermore, the PCR cannot diagnose the infectious status of a human in any proven way, and no consistent link has ever been found between a disease state and the PCR results. In short, the misapplication of the PCR means that COVID-19 is a scientifically meaningless construct that represents nothing more than a referential illusion. From the outset, the purpose of this misapplication was to provide the statistical basis for a pandemic based on a disease invented by the WHO for the benefit of elites and selected members of the pharmaceutical industry, not for humankind. As at 3rd of January 2020, with only 44 case patients with pneumonia of unknown etiology, there was no basis to prime the start button for the pandemic the WHO and the pharmaceutical industry were desperately seeking. Moderna and BioNTech, Pfizer's partner for instance, had lost almost $1 billion between them in 2.5 financial years between 2016 and 2019. However, following publication on the WHO's website on the 13th and 17th of January 2020 of non-peer-reviewed PCR assay sequences designed by Christian Drosten et al. To detect the purported virus, assays designed, as the authors acknowledged, without having virus material available, COVID-19 case numbers began to grow. Between 22nd and 24th of January, the WHO convened an emergency meeting to monitor the international situation. Despite there being only 17 deaths and 581 cases reported at that stage, this lack of cases posed a problem for pharmaceutical companies wanting to get their highly experimental genetic encoding devices, disguised as vaccines, onto the market without having to go through the normal approval processes, which they doubted they could pass. A public health emergency could be the means to bypass the stringent licensing conditions of regulatory authorities. By now, the RT-PCR tests were in overdrive, producing enough cases for Tedros to declare a public health emergency of international concern. And to stoke the rhetoric, this is the time for facts, not fear. This is the time for science, not rumours. This is the time for solidarity, not stigma. For in just 7 days, from the 24th of January, COVID-19 case numbers had risen worldwide by 1,245.61%, from 581 to 7,818, although only 98 of those were outside China. By the next day, total case numbers had increased to 9,826. Here was the international fraud in full view. Astronomical growth of a phantom virus that has not been isolated, let alone shown to be causative of any disease, with Tedros recommending as even more important than the public health emergency of international concern, accelerating the development of vaccines, therapeutics and diagnostics. The stench of fraud was everywhere. Drosten failed to declare that he was a member of the Eurosurveillance editorial board when he and his co-authors were published in Eurosurveillance on 23rd of January, 2 days after submission. It also emerged that Drosten would likely face court charges for holding a fraudulent doctoral title. Another co-author, Chantal Ruskin, also failed to declare that she was on the Eurosurveillance editorial board, and yet another of Drosten's co-authors, Alfred Lant, CEO of TIB Molbiol, failed to declare his conflict of interest until 29th of July 2020 that his company was the maker of a PCR kit based on the published assay sequences. For Lant, the deception paid off handsomely, as his company would later report. TIB Molbiol has been supplying COVID-19 PCR test kits since early January 2020. Over the last 12 months, we have delivered over 60 million tests. Suddenly the world was immersed not in a viral pandemic, but a PCR pandemic, generating fear around the world. But fear both pays and pays well. The institution with which this paper's most prominent creators were associated, the University Hospital of Charité Berlin, received a 2020 grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation under Invoice 5971 to develop diagnostics and virology tools to enable a rapid response to the novel 2019 coronavirus. totaling US $249,550. The PCR pandemic has now sustained the phantom COVID-19 pandemic for almost 2 years. While it is claimed that the PCR can detect a virus and an infection, that is just more deception. The PCR method simply amplifies genetic fragments. That's it. As we have established, no one has a physically isolated specimen or even proven the existence of the virus. That is why the Drosten PCR assay sequences were designed without a virus, as were assay sequences for the US Centers for Disease Control and Protection. In other words, the PCR has been calibrated to detect genetic sequences of a virus that has not been shown to exist in nature. Instead, it is detecting sequences of unknown provenance that are found in some humans and reportedly in some goats, a quail, and jackfruit too. As Carrie Mullis, the Nobel Prize-winning inventor of the PCR, pointed out,
it doesn't tell you that you're sick, and it doesn't tell you that the thing you ended up with really was going to hurt you or anything like that.
Indeed, despite purporting to be a diagnostic workflow for 2019 nCoV, the Drosten paper simply described the analytical sensitivity and specificity of their PCR protocol to amplify the selected nucleotide sequences. It did not establish any diagnostic specificity for any clinical condition. Hence, despite health authorities claiming that the PCR is suitable for diagnosing COVID-19, an Austrian court in March 2021 confirmed the contrary, its ruling echoing Mullis. A PCR test is not suitable for diagnosis, and therefore does not in itself say anything about the disease or infection of a person. The complementary partner in the PCR crime is the WHO's definition of a COVID-19 case. Essentially, a confirmed case can be, and most likely, will be a person with a positive nucleic acid amplification test, NAAT. That is, a PCR test, regardless of whether the person is unwell or not. This has created a preposterous situation where a COVID-19 case is nothing more than the PCR result from a test that is not a test, because the PCR has no diagnostic capability whatsoever in this regard, as it is simply an amplification tool. The positive PCR tests are then posted by organisations such as Johns Hopkins University in Medicine that display meaningless statistics as though they were legitimate. In other words, not one of the 243 million COVID-19 cases displayed on the Johns Hopkins blood-splattered coronavirus dashboard as at 25th of October 2021 exists outside of the viciously circular discourse that relies solely on the dual, unproven premise that SARS-CoV-2 has been isolated and is causative of COVID-19. As a consequence, we are now experiencing a medical tyranny, disconnected from the natural world and so absurd that the detection of a few genetic fragments in one person can be used as the excuse to lock up an entire nation. The fourth pillar, outbreak modelling. The astronomical case numbers produced by the PCR method became the basis of the reproduction number that initialized all COVID-19 outbreak models. Yet even relying on these worthless numbers, outbreak modelling, long notorious for its predictive fallibility, still managed to produce predictions that were spectacularly preposterous. The most prominent purveyor of this speculative nonsense was Neil Ferguson of Imperial College London, lead author of ICL's Report 9, published without peer review on 16th of March 2020, which predicted that 550,000 people in the UK and 2.2 million people in the US would die within approximately 3 months without non-pharmacological interventions. Its dire predictions caused governments to change horses midstream and predictably caused widespread panic amongst an unsuspecting public, creating an environment of fear and a willingness to comply with public health policies in many countries. When he eventually released Report 9's programming for public scrutiny, Ferguson found it ridiculed by commercial and academic experts alike. One commercial expert thought it a buggy mess that looks more like a bowl of angel hair pasta than a finely tuned piece of programming, while scientists at the University of Edinburgh reported that it failed the basic scientific test of producing the same results given the same initial set of parameters. 10 days later, Ferguson, who believes models are simplified versions of reality, predicted in another co-authored paper from ICL that 40 million people could die worldwide from COVID-19. Modelling mayhem in New Zealand was largely the domain of three groups. First to publish was the government's commissioned modellers, the University of Otago Wellington COVID-19 Response Group, with a report dated 27th of February 2020 in which the modellers estimated likely deaths to be between 12,600 and 33,600, the latter at 0.67% of the New Zealand population, equating to over 52 million deaths worldwide. Having conducted no due diligence into the originating circumstances of SARS-CoV-2, yet having collected miscellaneous information about it from hither and yon, quarter-loodle waddle doodle, including their reproductive numbers from 4 different sources and infected case numbers from Australia, UOWCRG predicted that the country's hospital system would be overrun with 336,000 people requiring hospitalisation and between 67,000 and 79,000 patients requiring intensive care units in their worst case scenario. However, the phantasmagoria of mass death on which the state of exception was decided relied not on the government's commissioned modellers, but on 2 uncommissioned, non-peer-reviewed modelling reports, the 8 authors of which, 4 to each report, had no qualifications in epidemiology or any prior experience in modelling a human epidemic. Their astronomical predictions were not the product of scientific rigour, but of algorithmic speculation based on case numbers from the MOH for one report, and for the other, on comparisons with international data on case trajectories and modelling studies for the UK and US outbreaks. Ferguson et al. 2020, in order to calibrate their reproduction number with control. The first of these reports was from Wigram Capital Advisors, a small macroeconomics advisory firm specialising in China and Asia. The other, Te Punaha Matatini, which describes itself as a centre of research excellence for complex systems, is attached to the University of Auckland. Wigram's models were run around 22nd of March and predicted 4,000 COVID-19 cases by 3rd of April and 10,000 by 9th of April. It was Wigram's modelling to which the government referred on the 23rd of March when it claimed, if community transmission takes off, the number of cases will double every 5 days. Suffice it to say, had COVID-19 cases doubled every 5 days and had community transmission begun on the 24th of March without lockdown the following day, the then 155 confirmed cases would have infected the entire population of New Zealand by the 7th of June 2020. Had Australia had the same number of cases on the same day, doubling every 5 days, its 25.5 million population would have been infected by the middle of June, and on the same basis the world's population of 7.8 billion would have been infected by the end of July 2020. TPM's lead author made his dramatic intervention on Sunday, 22nd of March, by going to the media with the alarming claim that his provisional modelling produced on his kitchen table suggested that 60,000 would die unless an aggressive suppression strategy was implemented as soon as practicable, which, miraculously, would save 50,000 of those lives. It was all rough and ready, the modellers having no precedent to refer to regarding the effects of such a strategy, but more importantly, having no idea if the virus even existed. As the lead author admitted, these results had been produced with a lot of guesswork, relying on overseas data, while the modelling itself treated New Zealand as one big city where anyone has the chance of infecting anyone else. A fundamental error that contributed to the report's preposterous fatality predictions. By the next morning, TPM's 60,000 had risen to 1.67% of the population, or 83,500, who could die without any public health intervention measures. A fantastical story with no basis in reality, but one that had parliamentarians shaking in their boots, and that the wizards still believe 1 year later. Extrapolated to the world's population, TPN's Ministry of Self-Promotion had just predicted that 130 million people would die worldwide. The small TPN group were richly rewarded by the government with a $6 million prize for helping them promote a nonsensical narrative and drive baseless fear into the population of New Zealand. If TPM were the winners of the prize for the most comical prediction, Neil Ferguson's ICL was the winner overall. Gates, who appreciates a scary story that confirms his predictions, shuts down much of the world and decides that only vaccines can reopen it, dug deep for his ICL brother-in-arms, pulling out of his back pocket a roll of grants for 2020 totaling US $91,494,791, Among those grants were invoice 16635, totaling US $1,080,771 to evaluate the potential efficacy of a RNA vaccine against COVID-19. Invoice 23013, totaling US $140,041 to model the potential impact of rapid diagnostics for COVID-19, and invoice 23210, totaling US $1,487,605 to understand how the social and other indirect impacts of COVID-19, social distancing, quarantine, etc., and perceptions of risk impacts sexual risk behaviour that could lead to HIV. While 2020 was a bumpy year for ICL, Gates had long been grooming ICL, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation having provided it with grants since 2002, totaling US $302,164,640, or around US $16 million per year for the last 19 years. While confusion and debate rages over these models, why the virus behaves so differently in different places, whether there is excess mortality, and whether the vaccines are effective, it is all a distraction. If one examines Fan Wu et al.'s original paper and all those that have followed, the truth is that SARS-CoV-2 has not been shown to exist. There is no such thing as COVID-19 outside of a malevolent narrative foisted onto mankind. The COVID-19 Fraud and War on Humanity by Dr. Mark Bailey and Dr. John Bevan Smith. Part 3. In summary, the COVID-19 fraud is the work of international elites, the pharmaceutical industry, and complicit politicians working to a globalist agenda, the purpose of which appears to be the extinguishing of human rights and freedoms and the dismantling of democracy for purposes of controlling populations and the extortion of vast sums of money from countries on the basis that a disease, COVID-19, invented by the WHO, poses a serious threat to their populations. Foundational to this agenda is the fraud that a novel coronavirus called SARS-CoV-2 has been found in and isolated from human subjects and shown to be causative of a disease called COVID-19. None of this has happened. The proposed remedy for this supposed killer virus is a spike protein produced by a genetic sequence that is not found in nature, but in a US patent from 2007. The vaccines based on this sequence have killed many thousands of people around the world and maimed and injured millions more. The statistical basis of this phantom pandemic has been determined by the misapplication of a PCR method that has no established diagnostic clinical specificity. It has not diagnosed a single case of a novel illness and has only produced meaningless COVID-19 case numbers. Accordingly, the New Zealand government is complicit in the worldwide COVID-19 fraud and thereby stands accused of reckless criminality, including human rights abuses, crimes against humanity, democide, acts of terror and mass murder. Conclusion. Since the Epidemic Preparedness COVID-19 Notice 2020 came into force on the 25th of March 2020, we have been living in the state of exception, which may be described as a liminal space between law and life, where the law no longer applies and where pure force appropriates lawlessness into itself in order to make itself the law. Positioned in a kind of no man's land between public law and political fact, the state of exception is not a dictatorship, but a space devoid of law, a zone of enemy in which all legal determinations, and above all the very distinction between public and private, are deactivated. Our homes as prisons, the mark of the needle, like the Star of David, the determiner of who is included and who is excluded, all embody the state of exception and may be considered forewarnings of what lies ahead. In closing, we hope that this essay might both encourage and help you to prepare for what lies ahead. For in this current climate, in this state of political entrapment, circumstances will only continue to deteriorate unless we rise up peacefully en masse to claim back what we have now learned is so easy to lose: democracy, the rule of law, and human rights and freedoms bequeathed over many hundreds of years, but stolen by this government in less than 2, all on the basis of an imbecilic fraud that nonetheless has terrorised and divided the people of New Zealand to the point of dysfunction, dividing families and friends, lovers, soulmates, colleagues and best mates. Unless we turn out of office by all peaceful and lawful means this iniquitous government, and we the people, as the people, govern ourselves in a form of dispersed, direct and inclusive democracy uniquely adapted to the circumstances of this place so that we can live ethical lives in harmony with each other, we will continue to be held in the chains of terror in which more and more of us will be state raped, injured and die from the poison being injected into our bodies to combat a disease that does not exist. This essay also hopes to encourage further investigation into the legitimacy of the methodologies being employed by the establishment virologists, as well as the misapplication of the PCR in clinical diagnostics. If these anti-science methods continue to be widely accepted, we are likely to see even more baseless pandemics requiring even more vaccines continuing indefinitely as part of the new normal. In fact, one manufacturer is already indicating its plans to develop an mRNA combination vaccine so that people can get one shot each fall for high efficacy protection against the most problematic respiratory viruses. There is nothing normal about the pharmaceutical industry and globalist organizations creating demand for unnecessary gene therapies through fear and the creation of pseudo-pandemics. There is nothing normal with regards to the unprecedented censorship of scientific debate and the prevention of medical practitioners providing advice to members of their communities to help them decide whether or not they wish to give informed consent to participate in the current population-wide medical experimentations. Indeed, medical ethics require medical practitioners to do just that. Only the most naive would believe that in the current contrived environment, a cabal of elites and an industry with an appalling record of injuring and killing people are making the world a healthier place for its inhabitants. Tyrannies come and go. This one, in its ascendancy, is already choking on the chicken bone of its own hubris. The scientific and ideological facades that this scam relies on will bring about its own fall, and with its collapse, a new dawning for us all to inherit. Closet tyrants, when they eventually emerge, are always naked, empty vessels full of other people's ideas, waging war on the innocent to hide from what they lack. They have not yet learned that control is a dead-end street, or that which sets the human spirit soaring is nothing more than acceptance. Postscript. As part of the process of peacefully taking back that which belongs to the people of New Zealand, Heterodoxy Society Incorporated filed a proceeding on the 6th of August 2021 in the Auckland High Court, CIV 2021-4041599. Regretfully, since then, on the basis of a legal contrivance that has no apparent statutory basis or value to the law, the case has been stayed. That is, confined to the equivalent of legal quarantine. Here is part of what the court has recently refused to hear. Crimes against humanity.
This was an intentional bioweaponization of spike proteins to inject into people to get them addicted to a pan-coronavirus vaccine. This has nothing to do with a pathogen that was released. This is about getting people injected with the known to be harmful S1 spike protein. And the tragedy is we are now sitting in a world where we have hundreds of millions of people who are being injected with a pathogen stimulating computer sequence, which is being sold under what the patent office, what the medical profession, and what the FDA in its own clinical standards would not suggest is a vaccine. But by using the term, we actually are now subjecting hundreds of millions of people to what was known to be by 2005 a biological weapon.
On the 20th of September 2021, a press conference was held at the Institute of Pathology in Reutlingen, Germany, in order to present in Part 1, Cause of Death After COVID-19 Vaccination, the findings of pathologists Arne Burkhardt and Walter Lang, who had investigated 10 deaths of persons over 50 who had died in temporal context of being administered so-called COVID-19 vaccines, including Comirnaty from Pfizer. In part 2, undeclared components of COVID-19 vaccines, non-biological items found in the vials of these products were presented and discussed by various participants, including physicians across and outside of Germany. Professor Dr. Burkhardt taught for many years at the universities Hamburg, Bern, and Tübingen, as well as visiting professorships, study visits to a number of universities around the world. He headed the Institute of Pathology in Reutlingen for 18 years, after which he worked as a practicing pathologist. He has published over 150 articles in specialist journals. Professor Dr. Walter Lang worked as a pathologist at Hanover Medical School from 1968 to 1985, then founded a private institute for pathology in Hanover, where he worked for 25 years. From 1985 to 2020, he conducted consultation examinations for the pathology of the lung clinic in Herne. They were accompanied in this presentation by Professor Dr. Werner Bergholz, a former professor of electrical engineering with a focus on quality and risk management at Jacobs University Bremen, who had worked for 17 years in the management of chip production at Siemens prior to that appointment. Of the 10 descendants who had undergone post-mortem examination, Burkhardt and Lang, relying on tissue material obtained from the forensic pathologists who had first examined the cases, formed the view that 5 of the deaths were very likely related to the COVID-19 vaccines. 2 probably so, 1 was unclear, and they considered that 2 had no causal relationship. In 3 cases they found rare autoimmune diseases, one of them so rare that they only discovered it when they looked closely at the digitized image. They were Hashimoto's, an autoimmune-triggered hypothyroidism, leucoclastic vasculitis, an inflammatory reaction in the capillaries that leads to skin bleeding, and Sjogren's syndrome, an inflammation of the salivary and lacrimal glands. There were a wide range of observed diseases, some common, some rare. To find these in a collective of 10 patients was very extreme, Burkhardt said. As he put it, we are looking at an immune system that overshoots completely, self-to-self attacking, and the inflammation is taking place in every organ, in every vessel, and this leads to strong autoimmune reaction and diseases. These are diseases, I would say, that are 1 to 100,000 normally. According to the pathologists, lymphocytes had flooded in and caused massive cell destruction. Burkhardt described it as follows in this paraphrased summary of his overall findings. I thought a lot about what I saw, and I could see only one thing, which is lymphocytes run amok, gone berserk in all organs and all tissues. We are witnessing an extreme immune reaction, a self-to-self attack triggered by the vaccine. I witnessed hyperplasia, overgrowth, and the activation of lymphatic organs, lymph nodes and spleen, and lymphocyte infiltration in non-lymphatic organs. As a result of this lymphocytic storm, we see the loss of external immune capacity and function combined with lymphocyte-caused tissue inflammation and destruction, with the risk of a prolonged autoimmune reaction. Nobody can say whether or how long it will take these tissues to regenerate and be restored to their normal, healthy state. The following are representative slides prepared and presented by Dr. Burkhardt during the press conference. Figure 2. This is a high-resolution image of a lymph follicle in pulmonary alveolar tissue. We also see these lymph follicles around lung blood vessels. This is clear evidence of alveolar damage in the lungs. What's going on here is that one's immune apparatus is attacking one's own tissues. Thus, the vaccines are triggering autoimmune diseases, which may not show up for some years. The massive infiltration of lymphocytes in brain, heart, lung and kidney tissue is a red flag for both autoimmune disease and cancer. Expect to see cancer rates go up substantially in the years to come. Figure 3. This slide shows lung tissue blood vessels with erythrocyte, red blood cell clumping. Figure 4. The syncytium has engulfed and is trying to digest one of these non-biological structures, identified by the yellow arrow in lung tissue. The syncytium will fail in its attempt to digest this. In part 2, a wide range of images of foreign bodies found in the manufacturer's vials were photographed, and their movements recorded by video. According to the presenters, none of these objects has ever been found in traditional vaccines and should not be inside human bodies. Their shapes ranged from SIM card lookalikes to long beaded filaments and large rock-like shapes. They appear to be metallic structures. None of the experts knew what they were for. Neither Dr. Burkhardt nor Dr. Lang had ever seen these objects in their many decades of experience. Yet these non-biological materials have evidently been injected into hundreds of millions of people. As Holger Fischer, a German attorney and panel member, opined, we do not have to have the burden of proof. If you had a lemonade with this sort of contamination, it would be off the market immediately. Maria Hub-Mamog, a physician from Austria, concurred. These vaccinations need to be removed immediately and their emergency use revoked. Referring to the narrative of fear, she added, people now want to vaccinate their children, even their toddlers. This is something unimaginable. This is pure madness, and this madness must be stopped immediately. After over 2.5 hours, Fisher brought the press conference to a close with the following statement. One thing is clear. Whoever carries on with the knowledge as of today is legally punishable. They cannot say that they did not do this deliberately, or at least partly deliberately, and this is a crime against humanity that is called deletion of human beings, and the parties are deleting their electorate here. Many people don't know how sick they are. Many may be finding out tonight that they need to get help. We want to save what can be saved from those who are already vaccinated. The following are selected images as presented at the conference of numerous non-biological objects found in the vials of these products. These alone should be sufficient to bring an immediate halt to the criminal rollout of Comirnaty in New Zealand. Figure 5. The rest of the slides show non-biological foreign bodies found in the vaccines. These non-biological materials evidently were injected into hundreds of millions of people. Several of the slides were furnished by other physicians in Germany or Austria. Neither Dr. Burkhardt nor Dr. Lang had ever seen these objects in their many decades of experience. Figure 6. UFOs found in vaccines. Figure 7. Looks like a cell phone to me. Figure 8. Salamander. Figure 9. A UFO in the vaccine fluid. Dr. Burkhardt states that he saw hundreds of these in cells, but this image is of a highly magnified droplet of vaccine fluid using dark field microscopy. Figure 10. Another beaded filament. Figure 11. Burkhardt notes the rows of blue objects on the larger blob. He wonders if these are nanochips of some sort. This shows the non-biological foreign object in vaccine fluid. Figure 12. Burkhardt wonders if this too is a graphene chip. Is this carrying who knows what information to the protein manufacturing apparatus in the cells? The final insult. While the deal Pfizer has made with the New Zealand government remains hidden from the public's eye, and while the contents of the Pfizer vials remain hidden from a government blind to its own perfidy, a leaked Pfizer manufacturing and supply contract with Albania opens a window onto the nefarious world in which this pharmaceutical giant wields power over and extorts money from nation-states on the basis of the COVID-19 fraud. This contract, signed by 3 Albanian officials, has made their government party to the fact that the long-term effects and efficacy of the vaccine are not currently known, and that there may be adverse effects of the vaccine that are not currently known. Yet Pfizer's vast profits, being raked in at US $12 per vial, according to this contract, are guaranteed, even if a trail of death and injuries are left behind, for which the purchasing government must indemnify, defend, and hold harmless Pfizer from and against any and all suits, claims, actions, demands, losses, damages, liabilities, settlements, penalties, fines, costs, and expenses arising out of, relating to, or resulting from the vaccine. Is this the same sort of arrangement to which the New Zealand Minister of Finance agreed when he granted Pfizer-BioNTech immunity from prosecution on the 5th of October 2020, an arrangement required to be notified to the House because the indemnity exceeds $10 million? If it is, then the New Zealand government is also party to a despicable contract to be hidden from the public for 10 years, to purchase a product that it knows and accepts is subject to significant risks and uncertainties and may not be successful, but which it has incessantly promoted as safe and effective, has mandated for large sections of the workforce, and is insisting that its poison-making sequence in undeclared foreign objects be plunged into the bodies of our children.